day of the Triffids, when terror rained from the sky. The day of the Triffids, when the Earth orbits into a nightmare. When the solid world of everyday reality disintegrates. And the whole population is driven by fear towards insanity. The day of the Triffids, when destruction closes in from every side.
Pilot, is he blind too?
It's going to be starvation, fire, pestilence. Anyone caught in the middle of it doesn't stand a chance. I think we ought to get out of here and go on to Spain.
How can you know it's any better there?
I don't.
Doesn't seem to have any central nervous system.
Then how does it move?
All plants move. And they don't usually pull themselves out of the ground and chase you.
You have never been married?
No.
Why?
Guess I've never been in one spot long enough to get caught.
And now you are saddled with a family.
It might have its points.
The day of the Triffids, when law and order are overwhelmed in an avalanche of terror.
Only the 90th time you've done this.
I know. Well, welcome,
Simple
ladies and
creatures.
gentlemen, to the Spine Crackers podcast. My name is Gabe. I'm one of your hosts for the evening.
My name's Matt. I will also be joining you this evening.
My name is Paul, and I'm also a host of this show.
And
my name is Guest, who has not been introduced yet.
There you go.
Challenger approaches.
And so
Who is
you may recognize, if you are a true person of culture in the online book sphere, the voice that you just heard of our very special guest for the evening, who we are thrilled to have join us and are very grateful for his time on his birthday, no less.
That's
It
right.
is
Yeah.
Seth, the proprietor of W.A.S.T.E mailing list, who you may know from Instagram, and who has recently started a fantastic YouTube channel that you all owe it to yourselves to go check out. Seth, how are you doing?
Well, first off, I mean, it is a pleasure to be here. Only the coolest people record podcasts on their birthdays. So that's how you know I've got a raging social life. And I am deeply sympathetic for anyone who considers my Bookstagram a reference for culture. So God bless anyone who that's the case for. It is a pleasure to be here, guys. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's I really admire what you're doing on YouTube there, just because as anyone who listens to this show knows, we like long form book content, and I think that specifically on YouTube is a niche that needs to be filled in more, and I think it's just important. I mean, I just get so I've done this rant a million times. I just get so frustrated when I see a review of I don't know, War and Peace. There's just some book that demands a lot of interpretation and is intricate, and I checked the video time and it's like 6 minutes. I'm like, okay.
There's a lot of Fantano style book reviews out there, and it's just honestly, it's a cesspool. So please help.
Look, I get the utility, dwindling attention span, that whole yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, if you're going to take a massive work of, reasonably broad scope, you need to give it the time it deserves, right? So I just figured there's only really a few big names in the YouTube space who are doing that sort of thing. Crispy is one I often reference. Guy's a legend. But, if I can provide a little extra mouthpiece, so to speak, in that particular platform, I'm more than happy to do so. So yeah.
Well, it feels like too, like if you read books, you already have a pretty good attention span, maybe. So you probably enjoy a longer video too,
You would think, but I don't know.
Yeah, snackable media and the war against it.
Oh, snackable media. That is a cursed term. I'll be using it later.
It's a real one. It's a professionally used term in circles.
I don't doubt it in the slightest.
Yeah. Well, this evening we are talking about a bit of a change of tone for the show, maybe in a way, just because, as we were discussing a little bit off camera, no one here really reads a lot of science fiction, at least these days. Although
Anymore,
I think most of us did when we were younger. I remember, Seth, you mentioned on the Beyond the Zero podcast that you were on recently that Wyndham, who is the author of the book we're reading tonight, The Day of the Triffids, was someone that you read when you were younger and have some fond memories about.
Was formative reading experiences was really sci-fi based. Some of the names that come to mind: Madeline L'Engle, John Wyndham, Nancy Farmer, a few of those names. And it's interesting because I don't read a lot of that sort of genre fiction stuff these days. But in saying that, there is also a certain malleability to these genre signifiers in the first place, right? Like they only have so much utility. You look at something like, which I referenced again off mic, Gravity's Rainbow, because I'm a one-trick pony and I will always find a way to reference Pynchon here. To a certain extent, you could call that science fiction. So,
right,
yeah,
that's probably a longer conversation, though.
Yeah, that's a can of worms, the genre thing for sure.
That's
yeah,
a
and we've
Patreon conversation.
yeah, definitely. We've had it too, just like
Mhm.
the, where those lines get blurred and who's been tagged with doing so, basically.
Yeah. Who did you read, Matt, when you were younger reading sci-fi? I was a big Arthur C. Clarke guy. That
Yeah,
was my
Clark was huge, like Childhood's End and the full sweep of the Space Odyssey
Mhm.
books. But I mean, like I was saying, like a lot of it was also, I was like undiscerning. Like I just was like, I'm 13, 14. Like I'm just gonna read, like, I don't know. I read, not that these people are bad, but like Jose Philip Farmer, Pierce Anthony. I
Mhm.
really liked. Robert Jordan, obviously, and then like a lot of Philip K. Dick and that kind of shit too.
Yeah. Paul, did you read a lot of science? You just read The Hobbit over and over again.
I honestly, The Hobbit was like the first book I read, basically. No, I'm trying to think, and I think it was mostly fantasy. It wasn't really sci-fi until I read some Philip K. Dick later in like early high school, but I didn't really read a lot of sci-fi. I think I'm actually maybe a little different than you guys. I'm trying to get more into sci-fi now. Like I have a few series I just want to read, but they're big chunkers and I just don't have the time right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fantasy stuff especially lends itself to like series of 12 books that are like,
God,
700
some of those
pages
books are
top.
long, dude.
They're long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of those Robert Jordan books, man.
Dude, yeah, it's a commitment, man.
Yeah.
It's like 12 to 14 books in that Wheel of Time series. Isn't
Yeah, I think something like 14. It's wild.
Like,
and they're all
I
like
love-
800 to 1,000 pages.
Well, that's exactly it. It's like, do I really want to commit to something where I'm gonna have to get in 3,000 pages before I feel like I've really sunk into it? Like there's only so much time I have on my hands.
I'm not
Exactly.
emo and 13 in my room with time to kill. You know what I mean? Like
You don't know that. You don't know that.
I
Yeah, I
am
kind of
somewhere
am.
deep down, but
We're
kind of am
emo and 33 in our rooms with lots of time to kill.
Yeah.
You can't see all my Protest of the Hero CDs. They're just off camera here.
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, exactly.
well, the Day of the Triffids is like it's part of, would you say it's part of is it the golden era? Because they have like the different designations like of sci-fi, kind of like they do with comic books too a little bit, which kind of developed around the same time. Like is this part of the golden era, the 50s, or
I don't know when people sort of what the historical designations are. Obviously, this was sort of the, this book is very famous. It's a very well-known sci-fi novel, right? There was a film made out of it about 10 years later in the 60s or so.
Mhm.
And yeah, I don't know about what golden age sci-fi. There's that era of sort of, this was at the beginning, I suppose, of the like atomic era science fiction stories that were produced rapidly. I have a little bit of a collection of some of those old trashy paperbacks that I love.
what are
What
they
I'm
called? The
reading on
doubles?
Wikipedia right now is like the golden age was apparently I'm seeing 38 to 46 and also 20s and 30s, and they're saying the 50s was more of a transitional period,
The Silver
between-
Age.
and then like the 60s and 70s is new wave science fiction.
Okay.
So
Right. And
Interesting.
that's what we were probably reading as kids, more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the idea of sort of putting it into that designation of atomic based or post-atomic
Yes.
bomb literature, because really, if you want to look at it, the dropping of the atomic bomb was probably the most significant event of the 20th century, and it kind of represents a fracture point where everything is kind of in reference to before or after that. And you're going to see a lot of stuff that kind of lurks in the shadow of that bomb being dropped, because this is what, only 6 years after that, right?
Mhm.
And there's very much that sort of Cold War anxiety hanging over this book.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get into shortly.
Absolutely.
The bomb is even briefly and obliquely mentioned. So yeah, I mean, as David Lynch said it, the bomb literally opened a rift into an alternate evil dimension.
Well, it's kind of like a real life sci-fi moment, the bomb, right? Sort of like the Will Smith snap.
Yes,
sort of like the Will
kind of.
Smith slap, right?
Yeah.
Still keeping it topical.
The world is Chris Rock, and yeah, okay, good.
Oh, geez,
no, these are definitely equivalent events: the dropping of the atomic bomb and Will Smith being slapped at the Oscars. Yes,
they're as eye-opening to me, which is frustratingly pathetic. But
that there's only a thin veneer of society held together by barely anything at all, and it collapses when one person acts.
That's right. Well,
Okay.
so Wyndham himself served in World War II for England, and saw, from what I understand, I don't know the details of his biography, but from what I understand, saw relatively heavy action. The whatever group he was with, I'm terrible with terms like this, military terms, but apparently was one of the ones that saw a lot of fighting at some important battles. So clearly his worldview would have been shaped by those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Did he fight in World War II or World War I?
World War II, yeah.
Okay. Because I mean, Matt was over my house earlier today, and we were discussing actually Lord of the Rings, the one that was written, because it was written 3 years after this book, and I was just trying to make some sort of connection between this and that, but it seems vastly different. But
I still think there's like a World War II,
World War One,
but I still think there's like a like again, and Dune similarly, like these things kind of, I don't think unreasonably being described as in reaction to this kind of completely world shifting event. But yeah, even a somewhat more maybe silly little story like this one is still tackling what are obviously some very like traumatic and like real themes, and maybe even things that Wyndham was like trying to cope with through storytelling or something.
I think that's super plausible. Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Well, I was just thinking, because I think one of his roles was like a fire watcher during the Blitz, right? And if you even want to scale it back a few years before the atomic bomb, like that's the era of the V2, right? And that was an entirely sort of anxiety-inducing period to live in London, because you've got these bombs that literally go up into orbit and then drop, and you have no idea where they're going to drop, and they explode before you even hear them coming, right? That living under that sort of condition, under that, trying to articulate the right word here, but just experiencing that must have been something that really informed this sense of anxious dread that kind of suffuses this entire book.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
like a new horror. There's like a new horror dropped, literally. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
New things to fear all the time now. Wonderful.
I also think it's interesting, speaking of the various roles Wyndham himself occupied, his first job for the government was actually as a censor for the Ministry of Information, which I think is fascinating. Especially, I read a sort of an academic article about this book that made some interpretive hay out of the fact that 1984 was published 2 years, I think, or 3 years before this, and Wyndham himself acknowledged that as an influence on his work broadly, if not this book specifically. So make of that what you will. But so maybe we should talk about the book itself a little bit. This was my pick, right?
Yeah.
So the book, I won't do a play-by-play of the plot here, but broadly it follows a man named Bill Mason, who, when we first meet him, is waking up in a hospital bed. We don't know why he's there. And we quickly find out that his eyes are covered over and he can't see. And this becomes very important to the text. And he quickly gets up and sort of quickly realizes that the world around him has completely changed from when he was last awake. There are people, essentially everyone that he encounters early on in the novel, everyone has gone blind. And we don't know why, although that does get explained and then explained again at the end, potentially.
Mhm.
That's something we'll talk about. And it's a disaster novel, right? It's a novel of sort of the end of the world. Paul, you all won't be able to see this, but Paul has his as his background right now on Zoom, an image from The Walking Dead, the first episode of The Walking Dead, Rick Grimes getting up out of the hospital. It's really like a almost identical scene to the opening of this book.
Yeah.
And so the story just follows Mason and his eventual romantic interest, Josella, trying to survive and encountering various groups of people with various different ideas about the best ways to survive. The other big wrinkle in all of this, of course, is the titular Triffids, which are a sort of experimental plant that have sort of been integrated into society peacefully. They're known to be dangerous. They have these long stingers that can kill you if they make prolonged contact with you, and they're aggressive. But they've been essentially, harnessed.
And importantly, they're mobile.
Yes,
they can walk.
They can uproot themselves and walk around. Mason himself worked with the Triffids as a biologist. That was his career before the end of the world, as it were. And
he worked for a Triffidologist, and he worked for a pharmaceutical company, basically, too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's the basic sort of conceit of the story. We can get into more details of the plot as we go. Yeah. Anything?
How'd you guys picture the Triffids?
Ooh,
well, he gives a pretty clear description fairly early on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like basically three-legged giraffes, rather, with like the Stranger Things. What's that little flowery-headed thing in the first season? That's
the Demigorgon?
That's the one. Yes,
yeah.
Basically, I picture a three-legged giraffe with a Demigorgon head. That was my image, and he made that fairly clear, I think.
He did. I mean, his writing is very like blankety, I would say. It's just like he kind of like he works through every like description really well. But even after he described them, I still had an idea of what I thought they were in my head. So I was picturing the smart bug from Starship Troopers mixed with a tribble, like a furry one, and I just couldn't get that out of my head.
None of these are plants.
I know.
None of these are even close to plants.
That was my experience.
I literally saw
bug, the brain bug.
The brain bug, yeah, that sucks the brains out.
I have no idea how you got that image in your head.
bug,
because he had like a little stinger,
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. No, Seth, you're not wrong. Paul is
admittedly.
wrong.
Yeah, I am wrong.
Your instincts are right. He's making an error.
It's out there.
I think it's better anyway.
I can't take that away from you.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what I saw. I honestly, well, they're on the cover of the Kindle edition even that I have. They've been rendered a ton in popular media.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I watched the 1962 movie in preparation for this, and so I kind of, unfortunately, my imagination's been co-opted, and I only see those things.
Yep.
Although those things could have slithered around, and I saw that these seemed to more like walk in an awkward way that became dread-inducing, which I kind of liked the, mental image of. They're
very shambly. They kind of like the way, if I'm remembering how he describes it right, they like have because the try in the Triffids is, as Seth already said, the reference to the three-legged, but so they kind of like plant one and then like lean forward and move the other two, and then plant the middle one and then like move that way.
Yeah, it's basically how I walk when I've been drinking.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Your legs are weird pseudopods that sort of just kind of get you at someplace.
And then
I'm self-conscious about that.
The other thing that I think is interesting and worth mentioning, at least at the top here, is that there is also essentially a third disaster that's ongoing throughout the book, which is this unknown, unnamed disease that starts sweeping through some of the communities that Bill finds himself in, and just killing people relatively swiftly. And I think it's never identified. There's a few ideas, but they all turn out to not be right.
Yeah, or it's just like, who knows?
This aspect of it was one of the things that really set it apart from other apocalypse fiction, because I've found in my albeit limited experience that with that sort of subgenre, it tends to get pretty samey if you read enough of them. But this is kind of interesting because it plays around this idea of the interaction of disasters. It sort of seeks to address the unpredictable and compounding ways that disasters can interact with one another. There's that rhetorical question of, what's the worst that can happen, but it rarely accounts for the possibility of 2 or 3 of the worst things happening at the same time. And I thought, okay, that's a nice added wrinkle to add a little depth and texture to this idea.
That's very true. And I actually, I'm with you. Like, initially I was like, oh, this is a fun bit of pulp, but like, I do think there is something there with that idea. And I agree, it's still not something that's explored often.
Yeah, at first I had somewhat mixed feelings about it. I was like, wow, okay, we're just throwing it all in the pot here, like layering on
kitchen sink book. Yeah.
But it really did grow on me, largely for some of those reasons that Seth, you just articulated.
Because go ahead.
Well, it's just, this is how that stuff happens in real life. Just look at the context we've got over here. We've got a raging pandemic with 25,000 cases a day emerging each day in Sydney. And we've also got floods as the result of horrific rain. 2 terrible things happening at the same time. And the government has no idea how to handle both at the same time, So I guess it's not just an interesting idea. I think there's a thread of reality to be kind of drawn from it.
Yeah, it's also just points to like a kind of realistic notion of how other civilizations have fallen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it makes me just think of like, what if Yellowstone exploded and there was a tsunami? Is it that unrealistic? But I think that one thing this book does well is that it kind of points to how they could be, all the disasters could be related to each other too. Is that like one could have made the next one happen, or maybe it's bad luck, but maybe the disease was a product of one of the disasters. Maybe the Triffids like released something, or what made everyone blind, there was something like a delayed response to the immunity or something. So it becomes oddly more realistic even after you realize it's such a pulp novel.
Go ahead, Ben.
Well, there's like a conspiratorial element almost by the end where it's like all of these things were man-made, basically, is the hint there. It's like these are all retaliatory weapons being used now in response to an accident from before, and then the Triffids are like a 4th man-made kind of threat that is now on the loose that they didn't expect to be so capable of adapting to our other mistakes where we killed each other, basically.
But this very much follows kind of in the lineage of the anxieties that came out of, like we said earlier, the atomic bomb blast, right? You watch something like that happen, something so incomprehensible to anyone who had lived prior to that happening, and all you can think is, okay, what the hell is going to be next, Biological weapons. Like, I think at some point in the novel, he has this sort of, he lists off kind of a few things that people are worried about happening following the Triffids. I'll see if I can dig it up here.
Yeah, and we should maybe just note the cause of the blindness, which goes through some changes, as I alluded to in the narrative. But at first, it's described as like essentially a freak meteor shower that he describes early on in the novel as being like the most, and of course he had this sense of, the narrator, Mason, had this sense of bitterness because everyone was just talking to him in the hospital about, oh my God, it was so beautiful. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. He had major FOMO.
Yeah, he had major FOMO, dude.
And then it turns out that everyone who saw it has gone blind. And of course, he encounters other people in his travels that, for whatever reason, they were drunk and asleep and they couldn't get up, or whatever. They also
Points for drunkenness.
yeah, exactly. This is a very pro drinking book, unironically, actually.
Yeah, kind of. Yes. Yeah.
I feel like half of Bill's journeys throughout this book are just going from one bar and looking for another bar.
It's very British that way. It feels like he's like, oh, thank God, another pub. Fuck.
Apocalyptic bar crawl.
That's sick sounding a little bit.
This predicted what's the Edgar Wright movie, The End of the World?
Oh, is that what it's called?
I forget
the end.
No, it's The World's End. That's it.
The World's End. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just remix it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So but later, by the end of the novel, and it's never confirmed, but by the end of the novel, Mason is speculating that it was like some sort of weapon or a satellite that had fallen out of orbit and released some chemical or some special type of light or something that was intended as like a localized sort of weapon, but malfunctioned or whatever, and essentially affected the entire world, which I think really speaks to that sense of, and which, by the way, is interesting because satellites had not even gone into space at that time. Sputnik was like late 50s. I think Sputnik was like 58 or 57 or something.
Mm-hmm.
So really interesting kind of, prophetic idea there on Wyndham's part. But this speaks, I think, to some of the things that Seth was saying earlier about this sense of doom and oppression from all sides, and the horrors of scientific advancement in the atomic era.
Like, the way I see it is, at least from Wyndham's point of view, I think the means don't matter to him. I think it's entirely the ends that they produce. I found the line that I was thinking about. I think it's in chapter 2, and it says, from time to time, there would be a panicky flare-up of expostulation when reports circulated that, as well as satellites with atomic heads, there were other things, such as crop diseases, cattle diseases, radioactive dust, viruses, infections, not only of familiar kinds, but brand new sorts. Like, it just goes on and on. It doesn't really matter what the thing is. It's just the fear of that unknown, that new, that it's kind of, this word is used very incorrectly a lot of times, but it's Lovecraftian in the sense of it's a terror and a horror. It's something that you can't quite articulate. Like, I know people like to use it as a way to describe things with tentacles, but that's the loosest form of Lovecraft out there. It's this fear of the thing that you can't quite see or can't quite visualize, but it completely envelops your psyche. And I think that's kind of the headspace from which he was working through this time period that he was living through, the 50s.
So it's sort of like Paul and the Triffids, because he couldn't describe them.
Yes.
I mean, they were terrifying in my mind.
An unnameable horror, huh?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they're trees with legs. So.
Brain sucking. It's scary. It worked. Lovecraftian in a way.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this starts the whole like I don't know, kind of modern almost trend. Like even a book, like I can link this even to a book like Leviathan, right? Because the Leviathan of the title seems to me to be a sort of subtler, mutated, even more unnameable version of this kind of initial horror that's bursting literally onto the scene in World War II. And then all the cope and machinations to make that not seem like something that's imminent, being themselves also a kind of horrific overgrowth. So I don't know, in that sense, the world is kind of a Lovecraftian horror of its own.
And I think that's really what is, occupying Wyndham here. I think what clearly this is, driven by his experiences in the war, and England at points in the war was on the verge of just collapse, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And I think that he is deeply interested in the realization that he had in World War II, and that many other people had, that modernity is balanced on a knife edge. Modern life and society is a fragile thing that can be blown over essentially with something as obviously these are huge events, but at the end of the day, they're sort of small. Early on in the book, he makes a big deal about like, I had never thought about sight being the most important thing to human civilization versus something like intelligence or whatever, some of the traditional answers. And so I just think that has this deep sense of the fragility of modern society and, our role in through science, I think specifically, and we should probably talk about his attitudes towards science throughout the book, are always capable of just undoing relatively quickly.
But it's a prescient mindset to approach fiction from, like, he wrote this in the 50s. So what are we, 70 years later? But you look at, not to bring it back to this again, but to definitely bring it back to this again, the pandemic, like the just incredible societal unrest that we saw in response to that. You could really map the way that people react to the combination of the Triffids and the blindness onto what we've experienced over the last 2.5 years, right? Like, I think there really is a constant here with respect to examining, all right, how much, or rather how little will it take for everything to start to break down, sort of House of Cards style, for lack of a more eloquent metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, even just pointing to like COVID and even the war in Ukraine, like what if they were both slightly worse? Just slightly worse. What if
nuclear retaliation is one of the Ukrainian sort of conflicts feared consequences. So yeah.
But I think that he also likes to talk about the issue of not only like the societal structures breaking down and being fragile, but also like moral structures too. I feel like he talks a lot about issues of looting and just like minor things that seem minor in this circumstance, but the main character Bill kind of struggles with his like altering morality.
I think they're one and the same for him in a way. Like this is there is a sort of 50s moralizing streak a little bit, right? There's like definitely an emphasis, like Bill finds a ersatz kind of family with a daughter and a wife. Like there are these sort of things that are, potentially a little bit more quaint nowadays. But yeah, I think they're the same thing to him, basically.
Well, the human psyche goes through some pretty bizarre changes under the conditions of disaster, right? Like you could almost look at it as sort of a loss of identity. He's really interested in exploring the way which civilized behavior, even the concepts of the self, can be eroded when survival becomes the core impulse to day-to-day life. And kind of to that end, he questions the utility of individualism, because under these conditions, the individual elements that comprise a person are flattened and you simply become part of a societalist or survivalist colony. Your only really distinguishing feature here is, are you sighted or are you blind? And how can we use you to achieve survival? And I think from that, a sort of twisted moral calculus can develop. And, he explores it through these different groups and factions as they develop, and what are their ideas as to how we can move forward from this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Bill's characterization is really interesting. That on that point that you just made, Seth, about sort of utility, Bill is kind of obsessed with just utility. Like, what's the best way to get through this? He has like those moments of moral qualms, and I think his moral evolution or devolution, I guess, depending on how you're looking at it. Starting out in the novel, he has compunction about getting food when he needs it, and there's no one in the shop, and everyone's just looting sort of wantonly, but he leaves the money on the counter. But and then of course there's the sort of pivotal discussion with the first big group that him and Josella run into at the university, who are sort of organizing a new society based around essentially like a Nietzschean transfiguration of value, where they're just, we got to throw out the entire previous system and like start from the beginning. And that's going to include things like, polygamy. We're going to have to make a bunch of babies. So forget all of your, social mores about monogamy and whatnot. and that's a big struggle for Bill. Not so much for Gisela, which I think is really interesting. I should probably talk about
but
that.
she herself wrote a book that would obviously lend itself to her perspective. I mean, but Gisela, right? Gisela, just a little bit off the top, like Gisela, she's another sighted person. She's like she's like 25 or something like that, correct?
She's like just 20, wasn't she? Doesn't really matter, but
I think
she's
she's like
younger?
early 20s. Yeah.
early 20s. Yeah, I thought so. Doesn't matter. Anyway.
Yeah, and she's sort of she was taken captive by a blind guy who was using her as kind of like a seeing eye dog to take him to food. And he kind of wanted a little bit more after that. And just as that was kind of going down, Bill, the White Knight Bill, he comes galloping in. He frees Gisela and he's like, I'm a good guy, come with me. And then they eventually
The Sight Knight.
Love it.
That's great.
Oh
Yeah, so that's how they first meet anyway, just to say that.
Yes, and she was an author, as Matt referenced, and she wrote.
What's the name of her book?
I forget the title of the book, but it's like
Bisexual Adventure or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. My sexual, it's literally something like My Sexual Awakening or something like that.
Yeah, it's like very like titillating, like shock value kind of book that got her this sort of almost unwanted fame for this idea.
It was, I think the title is Sex is My Adventure.
Sex is My Adventure. Yes,
there you
that's
go.
Right.
Yeah. A shocking 50s book. Yeah.
Now this, the details of this are starting to fade on me, but correct me if I'm wrong, but the actual content of her book itself is pretty passe, right? Like it's not, as I recall, it's just the title is racy, but if you actually read it, it's not particularly transgressive in any which way. We're not talking George Bataille here.
Yes.
No.
It was the title was essentially clickbait.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that this question of the relationship between identity, because the other aspects of identity that get lost is like, doesn't matter what, no one is a biologist anymore. No one's like your job, your former job doesn't really matter. It's all just sort of about what can you do in this community now.
Which also relates to my picture behind me, The Walking Dead, and like majority of the influx of apocalyptic, films or TV shows or books post this book, but it is just like a common trope now, right?
You have the blank
The loss
page
of
of a big
identity.
explosion or a big disaster, and then there's this grab bag of alternative notions of structuring a society or ideologically kind of behaving that a bunch of people try, and it's like a big thought experiment, blank canvas that you can kind of show those things in microcosm.
But I suppose the reason that tropes develop in the first place is there is kind of a universality that people can relate to, right? Like these preoccupations haven't left us. They've just, been repackaged a little differently from time to time. Like so much of the pop culture that follows in the lineage of this book is pretty much instantly recognizable. The first one, and I thought, I was like, oh, maybe I'm just being sneaky. But when I was reading the scene in the beginning of Bill in the hospital, like shuffling through, can't find anyone, I was like, I'm getting some 28 Days Later vibes.
Yeah.
And apparently the opening
100%.
scene of 28 Days Later was inspired. Danny Boyle was inspired by this novel and wanted to emulate. So the scene with Cillian Murphy walking through empty London was directly drawn from Danny Boyle's experiences reading this book.
Okay, cool.
It makes a ton of sense.
Intuited that. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think some of those descriptions are some of like those scenes early on when he's just kind of getting his bearings in the empty city are some of the most evocative for me in the entire book. There's some really great ones later as well, but I think he just does a really good job of capturing that sort of space, right? Where, because the sort of dominant thing that Bill notices is just silence, right? Because it's not like in a lot of apocalyptic scenarios, people are sort of instantly become violent, instantly go to looting or whatever. And there is some of that later on, but because everyone's blind, everyone is just wandering around, like trying not to bump into things or fall off a cliff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that first chapter, I like. That was amazing overall. The only part I didn't like in that chapter was when he meets the doctor, and the doctor like commits suicide out his office window
Immediately. Yeah.
immediately. Only because like the mauler in me was like, would that window break that easily? It's like, could he really just jump out of there?
Or I guess who's that suicidal that quickly? I don't know.
Yeah, it was a little bit.
I guess it's possible.
It's interesting. I
value.
mean, it is interesting to think about because I mean, there are other instances of suicide later in the book, or sort of assisted suicide that I think are much more kind of, plausible. Because
Sure.
there's this interplay in the book between, the people who think that a solution is imminent. There's a character towards the end has this deep and unfounded faith that the Americans are just going to come save us, which I thought was a really interesting little detail.
Felt nice and cynical and about the war for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
oh, absolutely. And then the people who are like, no, it's like this everywhere, and if there was any help coming, it would have already come. And that there's that constant back and forth in the book as well.
Yeah, there is the timeline I wasn't always clear on, like the sort of Nietzschean sort of Mormon polygamy cult thing. Let's go forth and multiply or whatever. Seemed to happen very soon after the incident. Like we don't have all the information. Like I don't know why we're jumping to this so fast.
Look, they had that in place well before this happened. They were just waiting for their excuse to get started.
Yeah,
They're
that
like,
was
"All right, this is our time."
That some Koresh motherfucker was like, yes, here we go. Because there is that like weird
moment.
Who was that elderly guy who's delivering that speech about like
Dr. Vorlis, I think was
Vorlis.
his name. Beedley
Right.
was the other leader of the group. Yeah.
Vorlis, evil name. Delivering this. He's basically delivering like the Dr. Strangelove speech. Like he was like, animals will be cultivated and slaughtered. Women will be chosen for their pulchritude and breathability.
Yes.
Like, but he was like doing it in this like fancy sort of preacherly way.
Yeah.
Political, like almost like a politician too. They described him as like a good speaker and
He's
charismatic.
charismatic. Yeah.
You would be amazed what you can convince people of if you say big enough words and in a British accent.
Yeah.
I've been falling victim to it. Yeah.
And especially if you can see and no one else can.
That helps.
Game changer.
Well, I was also thinking about, I mean, it is, you referenced it a little bit already, Matt, but Wyndham really does run through the gamut of all of the different sort of, ways in which society might restart and under what sort of organizational structures. Obviously, all of them is an exaggeration probably, but many, like we have that group that we've been talking about. There's another group that is much more militaristic towards the end of the book. And they essentially want to reintroduce like serfdom and
feudalist sort of structures.
There's a fundamentalist religious group that wants to restart society along those lines.
A bunch of Christian scientists who die and go like, we're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
Essentially.
But I think what's maybe most interesting about all of this is that none of them work. They all fail, right? To varying degrees of like disaster.
Yeah. And what would you describe the structure of the Isle of Wight spot then as? Because that seems to be characterized as like the good one, essentially, or like the least bad or whatever, least wrong, hashtag. But like, how would you describe that structure? Like, what was that? Anyone got a pithy thing to say about that?
So this is the one at the end, right, where they are headed after they ditch the militaristic guys.
Yeah, there's a guy who's just like, you can be a feudal lord, but we're gonna have this stupid organization based on feudalism meets like utility, like British utilitarianism, and they're like, no, we're gonna pick Isle of Wight. But like, what was the sell on that?
Well, it seems to be a little bit more like democratically oriented. Like there's this, we don't get a lot of detail, but there's talk of a council and talk of, you know, like people
it's like a republic or something.
People are free to join and leave as they please, and you know, sort of a you know, free association and so on and so forth. So like I said, there's not a ton of detail about it, but I think it's sort of like, you know, the vague kindlings of democracy again, or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. That's what I
was. There's kind of a practicality to it, right? It is an island. The Isle of Wight is an island, unless I'm greatly mistaken, right? So I mean, potentially you could kind of create some sort of physical barrier between you and aforementioned Triffids, right? I mean, that's probably the most simplistic way of looking at the benefits of it, but I didn't get a clear sense of kind of the democratic or political shape of the space.
Because there was still that streak of like, yeah, everyone's free to go about their business, but like, do you have better business in town? Which is still a kind of it's still a pretty big threat to loom over somebody in terms of like a free choice. I don't know. So all the other ones failed, and that one even didn't strike me as foolproof.
Is it just like
anyway?
the lesser of many evils? Like it's the least shitty option, for lack of a better word.
I think Bill says something almost to that effect because at first when the guy comes, because by this point in the story, him and Gisela have reunited. They're separated for a large portion of the story, and they've reunited at her friend's kind of family farm estate house out in the countryside, and no one else wants to go really except Bill. And I think he says something to the effect of like, this is, you know, the best of a number of you know, less than ideal options. Yeah. What I mean, I was trying to like parse what to take away from Wyndham's running through of all these various structures and trying to suss out, is there a political message here? Is this just like a doomer thing? Like these are all going to fail in the face of sort of, you know, humans. And this gets back to the conversation about his views on science, I think, you know, like our inability to understand the implications of what we've been engaged in scientifically, because the Triffids aren't going anywhere, as far as we can tell at the end of the book. They're reproducing at rates that we can't keep up with, and they're developing, you know, rudiments of an intelligence. And
they can communicate. Yeah.
So I wasn't sure how to parse all that.
Well, I don't know if he's necessarily interested in any one particular social structure and how it develops. I think he's interested in the interaction between systems, right? Like it's, all right, we have an interaction between various apocalypses. Apocalypti, I don't know the plural for that word. Someone jump in with that one.
Apocalypti.
There we go. Yeah, perfect.
Thanks.
Vaguely dirty sounding. I like it. And then it's, you know, all these different ideas develop as to how we can manage that. I don't think he's necessarily espousing that any one of them is the best possible option. I think he's much more interested in seeing how these different groups will relate to one another and how the power struggles between faction A, faction B, faction C, etc., will kind of bounce off one another and exist in this framework of, you know, individualism versus societal communalism. Is that the right word I'm reaching for here? Someone help me out here.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's they're sort of like each one is sort of like a proto creation myth for a various type of a society or possible creation myths. And I think it's telling that at the end of the story, they're, you know, Gisela and Bill are having just a bit of a chill moment on the hill, and she's like, should we, because they have a child at this point of their own, and along with the young girl that Bill finds on the way, Susan, I think is her name, right?
Yep.
And she sort of suggests like we should come up with a story to tell these kids about why the world is the way it is, when they're grown up enough to understand. And I think that it's I wondered what you all made of that, because I thought that was an important scene.
Yeah, because like the idea was to not just leave that void sitting there, and them needing some version of a reason to keep going, like that there was a purpose to the destruction, I guess. But doesn't Bill just kind of leave her hanging? he's not super helpful in that moment.
Well, he's very much like a pragmatist, right? I don't think
Yeah.
he's necessarily interested in the myths and the rhetoric that we use to kind of prop up what the hell happened to us as a society. I think he's more just interested in the practicalities of making it from A to B, so to speak. And I guess maybe that's kind of one of the push and pulls here is like, all right, what do we focus on? Maintaining a story as to what happened to us, or just simply trying to make it through the day alive, right? This idea of sort of history as a subjective construction. You see that all through post-war fiction, and how societal rhetoric kind of colors what is culturally and communally accepted as the quote unquote objective, and I use that word very loosely, kind of explanation for what we've experienced culturally. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think you're right. I feel like the maybe some of the stuff he saw in the war or whatever, it's more like a kind of pragmatist notion. I think he's pretty much disenchanted with a lot of the options here. But at the same time, he's just kind of in awe of the fact that probably having gone through hell and just sort of going back to the extreme, almost like clownish normalcy of like 1950s was like, it's astonishing to me that this snapped back to this kind of thing or whatever, and like, maybe there's like a perverse hope in that. And that's kind of the sentiment I got towards the end, was just like, what is Josella's like, this just goes on and on. That sucks.
Yeah.
But also she like, snaps out of it and like is like, also maybe that's impressive and hopeful. And then it's just kind of man v Triffids by the end of that.
Yeah.
the fourth category of novels from middle school English.
Yeah.
Did you guys pick up a satirical streak in here? Did you find some kind of pitch black humor in just sort of the absurdity of this situation, or is that just me?
That's a good question. I don't know if satirical would be the right word. I would, for me anyway, at least my experience, I'd like to hear more about what jumped out to you in that connection. But I mean, I think that there's certainly a type of, absurdism about some of the situations and some of the kind of, actions and some of the dialogue.
Like maybe absurdism is probably the more appropriate term here than satirical. I just thought it is a very unique rendition of the apocalypse, and it's sort of these highly, almost exaggerated, stylized characters who have very kind of vocal and colorful ideas for what the hell we're going to build up from, right? It's just, it had kind of an interesting, darkly comedic streak to it. Not expressly so, but I don't know. I just thought there was a bit of humor written in there.
Yeah,
I can kind of see that, especially with like the rate at which they come up too. Like they do appear rather quickly, like Matt said earlier. Like even on I think it's in the first chapter where he goes out into like a courtyard and there's a guy who just like has oranges or something, and everyone is already like acknowledging that this is basically their god. I think it's the first chapter.
Yeah, that's early on.
But it becomes like pretty relentlessly just like, what about this idea? What about this idea? So yeah,
like 2 days in and already it's sex cults.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I also think there's, just like a few specific scenes that jump out to me as really walking that line between just like melancholy oppression and comedic. Like there's the scene where there's the person who's like holding on to a can of paint like for their life because they think there's food in it, because they can't see. And then there's that scene like later on in the book that really jumped out to me for whatever reason, of this guy rolling a huge wheel of cheese down the road. I don't know if you remember that, but that made me laugh.
Yeah, the conceit of being blind and how debilitating that would be for a lot of people who have been sighted their whole lives to suddenly be struck blind did start to have more of a profound impact on me. At first I was like, that's funny, interesting. You know, the other guy said that the Triffids could be having advantages if people were blind, and then there's this ham-fisted thing. But it did start to get a little creepier as an idea to me after a while thinking about it.
I mean, I think maybe I'm stretching here a little bit, but I thought that I was trying to think of like what is the point of them being all blind, really? Like what and I've been trying to think of it for like days now, but maybe it points to like his Wyndham's like dissatisfaction with technology, and if no matter what, it doesn't have to be people going blind, but it's like we're suddenly in the dark if we go into an apocalyptic event. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, I was thinking about this too, Paul, like why use the blindness as the major sort of driving device here? And I thought of a few things. I'd be curious to hear what other people think. But one is that I was relating it to like this whole notion of the fragility of civilization. It's also just a commentary on like our subjective, like critterly fragility. Like we lose one sense and we're just like helpless. You know what I mean? For the most part. And I think that like Wyndham is just really honed in on this idea of all of this, right? Like our individual selfhoods, our bodily health and safety, and society itself just constantly balancing on the edge of a cliff, like a car that's like halfway over, and you never know if the wind blows too hard in one direction, it's just going to fall off.
Yeah.
And I think his belief that technology is actually propelling us further over the edge, and if an apocalyptic event happens, our reliance on technology will send us back deeper than like a past cataclysm, because I mean our species has survived cataclysmic events, but I feel like Wyndham just believed at this point in history when he wrote it, was just like, no, we could not survive one. We're too reliant.
Well, on that note of reliance, is it possible that he believes, you know, the more that we become reliant on technology, the more likely we are to suffer a cataclysmic event as the result? Like sort of, I know it's 50 years later, but literally think about Y2K, like, oh, our entire financial system is structured under a two base numeric scale that the second the clock turns over, like, oh shit, everything's gonna fail, right? Like that's a reliance on technology. Our nuclear codes are locked into that, our financial systems, our healthcare systems, it's sort of almost predating that by a factor of half a century.
Yeah, and everyone back, I mean, I was like 9 years old or something, but everyone was just like, there was no doubt that if it happened, it would be the end of us. I think we should start a new hashtag for next year. Or is it, what year is it? 2021?
Right now?
Yeah. So
2022, bro.
So for next year, is it 2022?
Yes.
Oh, I already missed it then. I was going to say like
I already missed it.
I already missed it. Joke over.
You were saying this should be the one.
Oh, I was going to say why 2022 K.
Why so serious?
Why so serious?
Yeah.
But I do think this is a really good example, this Y2K example, because again, it's like the creation of the Triffids is essentially so we can have like a cheaper type of oil, like plant oil, right? That was their big initial sort of commercial application, right? We probably don't have time to get into it until after the jump into the Patreon segment, but that second chapter with the history of how the Triffids were sort of developed, I thought was really weird and interesting, and I kind of want to talk about that at some point.
That was one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, no, me too.
I agree.
It was at the time, but I actually thought that it needed more. I thought it was really, really odd narratively to have just one chapter be from that perspective. And it kind of threw me off for the entire, I was kind of waiting for another chapter like that, and it never really came.
Well, it's a narrative necessity, right? Because this is sci-fi with a very particular set of rules and conditions set upon the story. So he needed to essentially have the exposition dump relatively early on, right? So it's, the whole novel is almost structured as kind of an oral history of the Triffid apocalypse, right? Like the very last lines, mild spoiler, like this is where my story joins up with the rest. And if you want to read more, go into the textbook on this story, or whatever the exact line says.
Yeah, the history of the colony. Yeah,
exactly. There you go. So I think just from that perspective, it was just kind of a practical choice, right? He needed to establish the rules to his world fairly quickly. And if you're looking at this from sort of a historical perspective, if this was, not a piece of fiction, but an actual historical document, then that would probably make sense to put that at the front half.
Yeah, it just like threw me off though. I think I was just like, as a reader, just like waiting for something more, some more exposition like that. Or and after the second chapter, I was like, oh, are we going to switch? Or is it going to be like every other chapter? Like we're getting like the direct experience of Bill and then something more grandiose from like a societal standpoint, but it didn't really happen. So I was kind of thrown off, but I do agree. It was needed. And it was actually a really good chapter. I really enjoyed it. It was weird. It was talking about like fish oil and Triffid oil.
Yeah, it's not an unclunky narrative. Like Wyndham is, like we said before, it's kind of a kitchen sink thing, and he does need to draw those lines and have these events sort of coincide in a way so that we're all like on the same page and like understand what's going on, because it would be easy to not. You're like, okay, they're blind and big plants. Like, I need you to tell me how those two things coincide and why that's bad and blah, blah, blah. So, there is a bit of a clunky takeoff, but I actually think he lands it like fairly admirably. And I understand why this was like regarded highly.
Yeah. Well, we're running up on the hour here. So we may, and as always, listeners, there is a lot more to talk about. I want to talk about the class dimensions of this book personally.
Wow, Gabe, really?
Yeah. Believe it or not, I know. Believe it or not. And I think that there's. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that second chapter in more detail.
Yeah, I held off because
I want to talk about Coker as a character, because he's a really interesting character. We didn't talk much about him. So if you want to hear any of that, you'll have to subscribe to Spinecrackers Patreon at patreon.com/spinecrackers for as little as $2 a month. You get the full episodes, access to the Discord, etc., 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 and we will love you for life. And yeah, right? What else? Okay, yeah. So that means we're moving into
Scrabble.
Oh yeah, we'll just Scrabble first.
Don't start humming.
I know. I always get the order.
I know
wrong.
you want to hum it.
John Williams, get the fuck out for a second.
Best song of all time. I know.
Don't you dare tell John Williams to ever get the fuck out.
No, he is welcome a little bit later.
All right, I have my word. My word is and I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's, I believe, Gymkhana or Gymkhana, Gymkhana. And apparently it refers to, it's a kind of like a British colonial term. So maybe some sort of mashup from Hindi or something, but it's referred to a place of assembly where oftentimes athletic events would occur, basically a stadium or like a sports club.
Okay,
cool. Rock on. I love it.
I don't have one.
Matt knew every word of the book. Matt's huge galaxy brain genius.
I grokked it. I grokked the whole book, and my word is Triffid, and we know what it is.
You're muted for the next 10 minutes. You missed the entire end of the episode.
Punish Matt.
Punished Matt.
You joke, but I was very close to choosing Triffid for my word as well. I was like, that's way too easy. The one I chose stopped me dead in my tracks, and you'll understand why in a second if you guys are fans of horror films. It was Cenobite. So here I am reading along, and all of a sudden Hellraiser jumps into the middle of the narrative, and I'm just like, what the hell is this? But as it turns out, the word Cenobite, Cenobite, is a member of a monastic community, which also makes me reframe how I think those Hellraiser movies. But anyway.
Yeah, at least you want to rewatch Hellraiser now.
Yeah, I was like, oh,
so like a monk, some kind of monk or something, or a nun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Then you have cenotaph, which is like a grave, right? Like a grave inscription.
Yeah, I think
epitaph?
That's right.
Cenotaph?
There's a cenotaph too.
Oh,
Let me look at
Various
this.
Thinking of
types.
Hellraiser as like a
Maybe this will be my word.
the Cenobites are like that. Yeah, it's a really change of my perspective. Like they're sexual monks or pleasure monks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh.
I mean, the oft quoted phrase is explorers from the furthest reaches of experience, right? Like
Right.
they're just
Mhm.
kind of pure pain and pleasure sort of melded together in a melting pot and left to curdle, so to speak.
Well, actually, here's
So
here's
good.
here's cenotaph. This will be my word. It's not in the book.
It's just a word that we learned this
It's just a
episode.
word we organically brought up in discussion.
I thought you were muted. What the hell?
I'm not. I'm free. CENOTAPH, a monument to someone buried elsewhere, especially one commemorating people who died in a war. So it's an empty
like
tomb.
The
The monument of the forgotten soldiers.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Tomb of the
Yeah.
Unknown Soldier.
Yes.
Does every country have one of those? Because we've got one in Canada.
Probably.
We've got one in Australia. I know that.
I'm
Like,
sure that something that serves that function probably.
A lot of question marks in those bodies.
Yeah.
Everybody got one. Skeletons in the closet, baby.
What? Wait, what are you saying now?
I don't know. Here,
All right,
someone else
Paul,
talk.
what's your word?
Mine is not as cool as either of those words, but it's miscellany. You probably have heard it before, you guys, but I have not.
It's a good one.
A group or collection of different items, a mixture.
It's just the noun form of miscellaneous.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't think I've read it before, and I was just like, "That's a good word." Kind of rolls off the tongue too,
It's a
but it
great
also
word.
kind of sounds like John Delaney. So I wish I had a backup.
It
sick.
is a great word. All right, well. Seth, we need your baritone.
Yeah, come in here. Do, 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 do.
Oh, I couldn't figure out which one you were doing there. Yeah.
All right, and now do it. Do,
Yeah, okay.
do, 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 do.
Yes.
Are we on 15 different keys
Perfect.
right now?
No.
Part of the
Uh,
charm.
That
It's-
was
it's
Beach
part of the
Boys
charm.
level, dude. We're good.
Our barbershop quartet is coming along nicely.
Yes.
that.
Only a couple more of these, and we'll be ready for prime time.
Sure, yeah.
So this is the segment. If you aren't aware, we literally just read another book, which means we get to talk about Harry Potter, which is all we wanted to do in the first place.
The only book
if
we
we're
actually
honest.
like. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. This book has a lot of characters, but I think as we discussed, there's probably only 3 of them that we really get enough characterization of to warrant a house assignment. And then there are the obvious Slytherins, the militaristic fascist guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The rapey
Ivan.
guy.
Ivan.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So let's start with who should we start with?
Bill.
All right, Bill Mason. Start at the top.
Hard Ravenclaw.
Okay, go. Ooh, explain.
Interesting.
Well, he's just like he's a total academic, right? That was kind of like that's the easiest one that I reach for when I think about the house designations in my head. So I just in my head I had kind of automatically lumped him in as a Ravenclaw. Like what are the qualities of that one? Intelligence, knowledge,
Curiosity,
planning ahead,
curiosity.
curiosity. Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, planning ahead. That's a good one because Bill is very, very plan oriented.
Yeah. So he was a hard Ravenclaw to me.
Okay, that was actually pretty persuasive because I
Actually, for me too. Yeah.
yeah,
I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
I felt like Bill had a weird, like, sort of streak of selfishness in him throughout the novel as well, in parts. Like we talked a little bit about his moral development, and there's a lot of times where he like talks himself out of helping people because it's like, oh, there's no point, I'm just prolonging suffering or whatever. And I was trying to sort of think about what that would be evidence for in terms of a house assignment.
I feel like that's Ravenclaw though too, like him
Old
deliberating.
rationalism.
Yeah, he's just rationalizing every interaction.
All right, I'm sold.
Yeah.
I'm going bad Ravenclaw.
Yeah, we called him a pragmatist too.
Dark Ravenclaw.
I'm
I
gonna go
kinda
with
think-
brave Ravenclaw.
Wow.
Yeah, I think he's comprised of mostly a sort of chaotic neutral Ravenclaw. I'm gonna put D&D stuff in here
I love
too.
it.
but then also astrology stuff because he's also Gryffindor rising. Or he'll do some brave shit afterwards.
I'm definitely linking to this episode on my Tinder profile. This is gonna make me look so cool.
You're chaotic.
Oh, yeah.
You're a chaotic neutral Ravenclaw with Gryffindor rising.
Believe me, it
Yeah.
works.
That'll get
Ladies
a
are
type
gonna
of
love it.
person. Yeah,
That will get a specific
that
type
will
of
get a
person,
certain
that's for
type of
sure.
person. That's all I can say.
Yeah. All right. I'll buy that, Matt. All right. Let's do Gisela. Gisela Mason, nay Clayton.
Gryffindor.
Gryffindor. Okay. Explain yourself.
I think she's just been doing her the whole time, but in a way that still like takes into consideration through like her shows of empathy or whatever, like other people. She even her description of her own like cowardice and stuff seems to me to be pretty much just someone like self-interrogating and trying to be in touch with themselves and do what's right in
Self-crit.
Yeah, self-crit. Yeah. Do a self-crit. I'm just gonna call her basically just a Ravenclaw or a Gryffindor.
I counter.
Hit me with it.
Hufflepuff.
Oh,
right.
boy.
So me being, the academic that I am, I did a very thorough Google search of the qualities of each Harry Potter house because,
Yeah.
preparation is key for this sort of thing.
Indeed.
It says that the main values of Hufflepuff are hard work, patience, loyalty, and fair play. And I feel like patience and loyalty are two characteristics, I should say, that I saw in her. Like, for one, just waiting around because the good chunk of the book, she and Bill get separated, but she stays true to him this entire time.
Right.
It's
She's faithful.
Yeah, exactly. And she's loyal to the people that she's staying with on their little farm commune. What was the name of that place? Not Trinsham. That was the questionable one.
I think Shin something, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in my head, I had her pegged as a Hufflepuff. Also, I have this idea, it's unwritten in the books, but I feel like the Hufflepuffs really get down after dark. And, the whole reason she's cited in the first place is because she just got way too messed up the night before the big green
That's
comet
true.
strike, right? So that's where I'm placing her.
The Hufflepuffs, they're loyal and they also stay on it, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
They're like band kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Famously horny.
Literally. They've been working mouthpieces all day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Actually,
Churning is the name of the place, by the way. I just found
Yeah. I'll actually I think Hufflepuff too, but I'm gonna still do Gryffindor Rising again because it's allowed.
Yeah, I'm sold on Hufflepuff. I think in terms of the loyalty and her just kind of being a bit like sort of a rock, rock in their relationship and her relationship with her friends. I kind of will maybe talk about this in the Patreon segment, but I wanted to talk about your feelings about Gisela, because I was reading a lot of Goodreads reviews about this book, and there was a lot of stuff about Wyndham's treatment of women, which we haven't talked about thus far. So put that in our back pockets as well, I suppose. What do you say, Paul, about Gisela?
Well, I was going to actually say initially Gryffindor, just because she wrote that controversial book.
Yeah, that's what.
So I'm a
kinda
little
got me on
torn
that path.
now. That was like the one event or one big thing in her
But
life that she did that was like,
if
that's
we're
pretty brave of her to do that and title it that way.
if we're operating on the assumption that Hufflepuffs are horny, it is a horny book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah. So I'm more of like a Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Rising.
Yeah, me.
to use a Matt term.
Yes.
Yeah.
Use it.
Yeah, fair enough.
She's a Huffledore. We'll put it that way.
Sure.
Should we talk about? We didn't talk about Coker really at all. I think he was the other one that we mentioned, maybe justifying a placement, but we haven't discussed him.
He can be a
thus far.
bonus character.
All right, so we'll do Coker later as a bonus after we talk about him a little bit. All right, that means there's only one thing left to do. Score
Dibs
time.
not first. Dibs not first.
Oh, I think Matt got it first. Which means you got to go, Paul.
Oh my God, are you kidding me? On my screen, I was clearly ahead of him.
I know, but audio, I heard Matt first.
Okay, that's bullshit. But
It's not.
I mean, I don't know how to rate this book, honestly. I guess we didn't really talk about the writing style too much, but I really love Wyndham's writing. Like I think I mentioned earlier that like he kind of, I keep using this word blanket, but he kind of just covers like everything you're thinking and every aspect, and his sentence structure is just like crisp, and the use of adjectives and everything just like hits me hard, and I just love it. I could just like read anything he writes. And I think just in terms of a post-apocalyptic story, I think that it's really unique and odd, and it just brings up a lot of like unique ideas in a realm that isn't entirely unique anymore in 2021.
It's 2022.
Is it 2022? Are you serious? Like, I'm really.
Are you
I'm
joking,
now.
dude?
I'm not
fucking
even
with
kidding.
us?
You must be fucking
No.
It's
with
the
us.
year 2022.
I'm getting really old or something. I don't know.
It has been now for a minute. Yep.
Oh, it's been going on way too long for you.
So now in 2050, it's just like weird to talk about this book. No. So I don't know. I'm gonna give it a 3.75.
Nice. Solid
Okay.
rating. Matt, that means you got to go next. I get to go last. Well,
Yeah.
Seth can go last, but I'll go before that.
Yeah, so mine's less than Paul's, but I just kind of like it, at per usual upon discussion of the book. Yeah, I'm like, I kind of appreciate it more. Think about its date of publication, and just sort of like, yeah, a lot of the out and out weirdness of this type of story that, as we mentioned before, even in a somewhat exhausted genre, has a take I'd not actually seen, which kind of surprised me to like realize during the discussion. Yeah, in the Goodreads sense, it gets a 3 from me. I like it. Right? Isn't that what it says when you click on it? It's just like, I liked it. I liked the book quite a bit. It
so
was
flat 3.0.
Just a 3.02 if you want. But just a very solid little story, with a lot in there if you wanted to dig. And yeah, as Paul said, very like plotted, like a lot of plot, like a lot of elements happening in sequence in a story. Yeah, I think it's deservedly famous. I see why it was, and I'll read some more Wyndham for sure.
Nice. Seth, you want to go last or you want to go second to last? Dealer's choice.
Whatever. Dealer's choice. Look, I'll give it to you now. I'm like a flat 3, right in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Twinsies. It's one of those things where it's just like capital P plot, which that's more of a me thing than a Wyndham thing. That it tends to not be the type of book I gravitate toward. But in saying that, when you kind of look at it in the historical and cultural context of the era, I think it's interesting to think about, particularly in reference to other works that kind of play on similar anxieties, like, unsurprisingly, that I'm going to reference now, Gravity's Rainbow. Similar post-war terrors, which I think are an interesting and prescient space to explore. And I quite liked the idea of interacting disaster events and how people essentially come to terms with that happening. So yeah, I liked it for sure. Kind of 3 on the nose.
Yeah. I'm in the same area as you two. I think, I was trying to compare this to The Kraken Wakes, which is the other Wyndham that I've read, and that's not helpful for the listeners because that haven't talked about it and they haven't read it. But I think I liked that one slightly more than this one. But agree with everything that's been said. Like the fame that this book has and its relevance to the history of this genre is apparent. In terms of its influence, its sort of some of the tropes that get picked up from Walking Dead to 28 Days Later, obviously, right? So I think that it is a work that is worth reading for anyone who's interested in the sci-fi genre, specifically apocalypse novels, more specifically, and anyone who's interested just in the history of where some of these ideas came from. And even for being the sort of, if not the origin, one of the most influential books in that sort of, type of novel, it still is very fresh in terms of like a lot of the ideas that are in here and the approaches are still, interesting to me in reading them. And I think add in the historical context, add in Wyndham's experiences in World War II, and you have something that I think is, as Matt said, maybe more there than it initially appears. So
especially, oh, sorry,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, like, especially what is probably the most superficially laughable element, which is just like big killer plants.
Yeah.
That's actually what makes it kind of, I don't know. That's the stuff that actually separates it from other things in a way that's like genuinely interesting.
Which we also didn't really talk about the environmental aspects of like, I want to know if this book is eco-fash. That's my question.
All right, you save that shit.
I know, I'm saving it. So anyway, I'm at a 3.1. So just a little hair above.
Wow. I guess my score is bonkers, 3.75. I think I'm giving it more like a historical and odd credit than you. Maybe just like
you freaking out already about your number.
No, I'm maybe 3.5.
We've made him self-conscious.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
No one has to explain themselves here, Paul. This is a safe space.
Well, then I'm not going to explain myself.
Hell yeah, Gryffindor for Paul.
All right. Well, if you want to hear the rest of the discussion, stick around for the Patreon segment, patreon.com/spinecrackers, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, etc. Seth, where can the people find you? Remind them, shout it out.
Plug it.
Basically, Waste mailing list on all platforms. So Instagram, Twitter is just Waste mailing because they've got character limits, and Waste mailing lists on YouTube. That's kind of the three main places that I traffic right now.
Nice. Can I ask what's the next YouTube video you're going to be working on?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I am currently throwing one together for Mircea Cartarescu's Blinding.
I just bought it recently.
There you go.
It's unreal. I'm about halfway through it. It is about as far away from this book as it can be, but it is truly something else. Highly recommended.
Fantastic.
Cool.
All right. Well, Seth, thanks so much for your time. This was a fantastic discussion. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Pleasure and a privilege to be here. Can't wait to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. All right, everybody.
Thank
it easy.
you, loyal audience. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.